So it doesn't show on the models, right? But there are connective tissue coverings over the entire brain that altogether are called the meninges. Okay, there are 3 layers. The outer layer is a tough protective covering called the dura mater. Sometimes it's just referred to as the dura. If you take off the dura, under that there will be sort of a fine, thready, cobwebby type of layer that's called the arachnoid mater. Arachnoid means spider. And then if you take all of that off, it will look a lot like what you're seeing here. All right, it looks like there's nothing on there, but the third inner, very, very fine layer called the pia mater, which means soft mother, is still on there. Okay, and again, it's really thin. You can see through it. You don't really even realize it's there, but if I were to push down on a real brain with a probe, you would see it kind of dimple in and then sort of pop through as we get through the pia. Okay, so the cerebral hemispheres. The frontal lobe is the front part of the brain. If you look especially on, it's easier to see on these models, on the right cerebral hemisphere. So this is the right cerebral hemisphere, the left cerebral hemisphere. If you find 2 gyri, remember the gyrus, one gyrus means like a bump or a hill, one sulcus is the groove between them. Plural is gyri and sulci. So if you find these 2 gyri that run together all the way down like this on these models, okay, and you find the sulcus in between them, that is going to be the central sulcus. Okay, the central sulcus is the division point between the frontal lobe, which is the cortex in front of it, and the parietal lobe, which starts at the central sulcus and goes back to about here. Okay, so frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, down here. Okay, and then the thumb parts that sort of stick off to the side here, that's the temporal lobe. And if you were to pull down the temporal lobe and peek inside, you see there's more cortex in there. Remember, the cortex specifically refers to the gray matter that's covering the cerebral hemispheres. So there's cortex in there, and that's called the insula, or sometimes the insular lobe. Okay? I'll come back to putting it together in a minute, but if you also just look at this part, you can see the insula on either side there. So that's insular cortex, or insula. Okay? All right. So let's see, those were the lobes. Where are we? Okay, we did those. So the other thing is if you are, then let's go back to, okay, so if we look at, remember, primary cortex refers to areas of gray matter that are specialized for specific functions. Okay, in a primary cortical area, if it's a sensory area, it means it's the first cortical area to receive incoming sensory information. If it's a primary motor area, it means it's the first area to create a descending tract. All right, so again, back to the central sulcus. The gyrus in front of it is the precentral gyrus. This is where the primary motor cortex is. Okay, so this is the region of your brain that is creating the descending motor tracts. And if I were to stimulate it, it would create movement somewhere in your body according to where the motor homunculus is wired up, basically. Okay, the one behind the central sulcus is the post-central gyrus. That one has your primary somatosensory cortex. So those are the sensations coming from your body. So you can think of them as, things that you feel on your skin or inside on your organs. So that could be temperature, it could be pain, it could be touch, pressure. All of those things are general senses or your somatic senses. So this is primary somatosensory cortex. And there's a sensory homunculus that you can map out on there showing which parts of the body are sending sensory information to which points along the post-central gyrus. Okay? Other areas that have primary sensory cortices, so the very back, the tip of your occipital lobe has your primary visual cortex. Okay, the superior part of the temporal lobe has your primary auditory cortex, and you can remember that partly because, you know, your ear is somewhere around here too, so it's going on in. Okay. The insula, so the one in there, has the primary gustatory cortex, which is taste. And if you look at the inside, so the medial part of the temporal lobes, right in here, there's this part that bulges up. It's called the uncus, and that has your primary olfactory cortex in it.
Can we point to it?
Okay. So here are the olfactory bulbs, olfactory tracts. Okay.
Where were the bulbs at?
So right at the end of the tracts, there are these sort of bulby parts. Those are the bulbs. So they're cell bodies of neurons in the olfactory bulbs, and their axons go through and are part of the olfactory tracts. Okay? So inside your nose, you have cells that are basically the smell receptor cells. Okay? The axons of those cells bundle together to form nerves, and there are lots of little tiny clusters of little fine nerves that come through. They have to get through your skull, so remember they go through all those little holes in the ethmoid bone, in what we call the cribriform plate. They come through and they synapse on the cells in the olfactory bulb. Okay? Okay. So now, ventricles. All right, remember that you have this series of connected fluid-filled chambers in the brain. They're full of cerebrospinal fluid. Okay? This right here is the corpus callosum. It's the big fiber tract that's connecting the right and the left cerebral hemispheres to each other.
Can you point it one more time, please? Thank you.
Okay. This little white tract underneath here is called the fornix. That connects some of the limbic system structures together. Okay, so those are the structures that deal with a lot of things like memory and emotion, and sort of linking that together with some of the sensory input that's coming in. Okay, so that's connecting things like the hippocampus and the mammillary bodies and those things that we talked about.